Hi there, everyone. I'm Dr. Nanika Kaur, and I am here now with Dr. Khadijah Cyril, a licensed psychologist who specializes in helping children, adolescents, and young adults navigate a range of mental health challenges, from anxiety and depression to behavioral issues. With a passion for providing research-backed treatment, she also has specific expertise in assisting individuals and families with racial identity challenges and those from high conflict households. She's dedicated to helping her clients develop strategies to support their social and emotional needs. Welcome, Dr. Cyril. I'm glad to have you here on Project Parenthood to talk with us about helping kids with racial identity development. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Dr. Kaur. I'm so glad to be here. Yeah.
Well, before we jump into talking about kids and racial identity, can you just tell us a little bit more about your practice?
Yes. So I work as a psychologist. I work throughout the lifespan. I work with children, teens, and young adults, and with complex needs such as depression, anxiety, complex trauma, personality disorders if they are emerging or have already emerged. And so I like to use like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, and other like eclectic approaches to really help people exceed in their life and the circumstances that they're going through at that current moment. And so, yeah, I love working with children and families. And yeah, I'm really glad to be here and have this conversation with you today.
Thanks for letting us know a little bit more about your practice. And so let's sort of jump in and just talk a little bit about racial identity. And, you know, like when we're talking about racial identity, like really, what are we talking about? Can you talk a little bit about, you know, what is racial identity and like, why is it important? Like, what's important about it for us to know as parents?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, there's a way in which like children come into this world with like features, whether it be a certain hair texture, skin color, eye color, that not necessarily was chosen, but has a large impact on how they see themselves and how the world sees themselves. So it's a really important conversation to have, regardless of what those features look like. And I think making sure we develop healthy children who understand some of the privileges and disadvantages of those features could create a place where they could help support their mental health and well-being. And so I think it's a very important conversation for us to have, and I'm glad we're having it. And yeah, and there's research that demonstrates that like having a positive racial identity does support your mental health, and it is a protective factor. So I think even though we think that it might be a separate conversation, it's very much a prevalent and pertinent conversation for us to be having today.
I love what you're saying about that. You're talking about having a healthy racial identity supports one's mental health, right? And you also talked about this idea that, you know, we have these particular features that correspond with, you know, a race, right? That other people have assigned us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that it comes with particular advantages and disadvantages, right? And you know, that when you said that, I felt a little bit like, oh, like the word disadvantage really like hit me, because I was like, oh man, like that's true. Like, you know what I mean? Like there are disadvantages. I mean, I think that there's a swath of people who wouldn't who would disagree. Like there's no disadvantages. It doesn't matter, but it really does. There are disadvantages, right? If I get followed around a store and someone else does not get followed around a store, that is a disadvantage to me. And so I think that's so important that you put it that way. That really just stood out to me. And, you know, this idea that our racial identity being a healthy one, thinking in healthy ways about our racial identity, how that really serves our mental health, how that really it makes a positive impact on our mental health. And I'm wondering if we can tease out a little bit the difference between racial identity and cultural identity. And, you know, how are those two things different? And how can parents sort of make sense of those two different things?
Well, racial identity is based on features that were given to you, right? Like I said, like your eye color, hair colors, skin color, right? Your cultural identity is more related to your family traditions, the food you eat, how you communicate with each other, how you express yourself, right? And so while one is more so, I will say, prescribed onto people. Another one is more so how your family culture has like developed through generations. And yeah, I think that's also something important to discuss and celebrate too. And I think when it comes to both aspects, racial identity and cultural identity, I think it's really important for children and teens to like have a very comfortable sense of who they are and it be valued and appreciated. And it starts in the home, right? So like, I'm Haitian American, right? And so, I grew up eating rice and beans and chicken and saspa, which is like a bean soup. And so that has an impact on, how I navigate the world based on like, food preferences I had. While like somebody who may be African American might have different food choices and how their home environment might have been different. But when we step outside of our home, we are perceived very similarly, whether one is Haitian American or Nigerian American or African American. We are looked at very similarly, and we are seen to have very similar experiences. And that's where that racial identity umbrella is very helpful for us to understand that. So even if we have different culture identities and that has an impact on how we see the world, right? Like I grew up like in an immigrant household where you have three choices: doctor, lawyer, engineer, right? But when you go into this world, you might see that like, hey, because you have this skin color, we are going to perceive you in a certain way. And so I think it's really important for both those identities to be developed in the household, like how people are perceiving you outside the home, but how we exist inside the home, and they should be valued and appreciated
Yeah, I love what
equally.
you're saying. The idea of cultural identity, being around the sort of generational traditions passed down through generations. And it's interesting because a lot of people talk about people of color being like the only people who have a cultural identity, but that isn't true, right? Like if we're talking even about white folks from different regions of America, right? They're eating different things, listening to different music, interested in maybe different kinds of arts and culture,
Again,
experiences, right? Some
agreed.
people are at like a monster truck rally or like a NASCAR race, and some people are like at the Met, like seeing opera, or some people are at like a baseball game, or some people are at a football game, or some people are celebrating like their perhaps Irish culture, or their, I'm thinking of my own child who there's something at their school called a culture share, where kids bring in something from their family culture, and sometimes their family culture is like their nuclear family, like their parents and their siblings and themselves, right? Like not necessarily generations, right? And people will bring in all kinds of food. There's one kid in my kids' class who's like very into like riding horses and brought in all kinds of stuff about riding horses, you know what I mean? But it's like that is the culture of their family. They are equestrians, like that's what they do.
Yeah.
And I think it's so interesting. They're actually not even American. They're from another country, but they are equestrians and that's their thing and they're super into it. This child writes every story about horses. The idea of culture, everyone's got one, right? And I think it is so important for parents to be explicit about here's, what do you notice about the culture of our family, right? Like maybe the family just that's in our home, but also our extended family, the culture of our neighborhood, the culture of our city, right? Those are all cultures too. And racial identity is, as you were saying, it's more about appearance and like a category that someone has put you in. And although we might see a sea of Black faces, that doesn't mean that their culture is all the same, as you're saying. Some people are Haitian, some people are Nigerian, some people are Ghanaian, some people are Ethiopian, some people are Caribbean, like from all kinds of places in the Caribbean, right? And so there's, I live in Brooklyn, and, somebody from Trinidad is going to be very different from someone from Barbados, and somebody from Jamaica, and someone from Haiti, and someone from the DR. So like, it's all very different, right? And it's really important for us to sort of be delineating that for our kids and letting our kids really have some knowledge about their own culture, right? But also give them this idea. They also sort of need to know about that racial piece, like that the world is looking at you in a certain way that has nothing to do with who you are or what your culture is, actually. That is just something else entirely.
I love that you said this point. Like culture, this is the idea of culture. Everyone has one. Everyone's got one. That's so true. And so when it comes to a parent, right? I think sometimes when you grow up in a European descent, you might be perceived as the dominant culture, and because you're the dominant culture, I don't have a culture because it's normalized. But you have a culture too, and so that might be something to start with to explore. Like, what is my culture? What is my family? Traditions and backgrounds. You're going to assess that there are certain things that are beautiful about your culture and certain things that are like can be worked on. I can use myself as an example, right? My family, like education and working hard has been a value that has been instilled in my family, my parents. Like it's something that I find was a protective factor for me as I kind of navigated school. That education is a very strong value, and working hard is important. But maybe talking about your feelings is not as valued in your family, right? Like, what do you have to complain about? You have food, house, shelter, you're doing well, right? And so that was something I may not be as valued in my particular culture compared to like other things. And I think that's probably pretty similar for other culture experiences too. I'm curious what your thoughts on. I don't want to just pick on my culture. Yeah.
Oh yes. My culture is Black American culture, but like Black American Southern culture specifically, which is a particular type of culture. My parents were the generation of kids whose parents great migrated to larger cities, right? So they may have been, so their own parents had been born and raised in the South, born and raised in the Jim Crow South, and then sort of great migrated themselves to New York City and to Washington, D.C. And so they sort of had a city kind of upbringing, right? Even though their parents had a very rural upbringing. And both my parents were sent back to the South for the summers. And so they had this sort of, city life, country life that they were navigating, these two cultures. And that kind of showed up in the way that I was raised, right? I was raised in this way of like knowing about the city and street smarts and all of those things, but also these sort of down home country kind of sort of background and food culture and that kind of thing. But, education was very important in my family too. That was the way that my family sort of rose the class ranks, was through education, right? And so I was taught that same thing, that idea of like education is the thing that is going to save you. And then also, as you were saying, emotions are just not on the table here. I don't know what you're talking about. What do you mean? What do you mean an emotion? What do you mean feelings? Like, this is not something that we had the time or, we're busy surviving Jim Crow. We're busy surviving segregation. We're busy surviving great migrating. We're busy like trying to get our kids through school and have them not, be the victims of some kind of horrific racism or violence. And this is what our priorities are. We're not really here for your, teenage angst. We're not really here for that. And so yeah, those are part of my culture, was that sort of absence of talking about psychological health, mental health, how anyone is actually like feeling or doing inside. Like that really wasn't prioritized or really even known about. So that's another thing about culture, right? Like I can shift that. I can't shift my Blackness, but I can certainly shift the culture of parenting itself, right? I'm going to parent my child in maybe a slightly different way. I want my kid to get all that background, all that yummy Southern Black culture that's fun and awesome and yummy. But like, I also want to do something a little bit different. I like your inner space, your internal world. My child's internal world is just as important to me as my child's performance at school. That's how I've sort of shifted my own family culture in my own home. But, now that we sort of have this idea of like racial and cultural identity, I thought we would talk a little bit about that like the development of one's racial identity. And so like Janet Helm is an academic person who developed the people of color identity model as well as other racial identity models. And I wondered if you could just sort of give us a little snapshot of that idea of like how racial identity, how Janet Helm views racial identity as developing across stages, and a little bit about that in terms of like how maybe underlying we're not really thinking about it, but we all are sort of going through these stages of identifying with whatever our race might be.
Yeah, and Dr. Janet Helms, yes, she's a counseling psychologist, I think, and she's a professor right now at Boston College. I actually remember when I was in grad school going to one of the conferences and like seeing her briefly, and like I guess that would be like the psychology nerd version of like seeing a celebrity because she's done very amazing things in this field, and yeah, she developed identity theory models on what it like on whiteness and biracial, being biracial and multiracial, and Black people, people of color. And so I think that, without getting into the weeds, I think when you look at those racial identities, there's this idea that you start off with wanting to follow the dominant culture. And then as you go through those models, the end result is respecting your culture and respecting the cultures of other people and trying to help people who may have been marginalized and disadvantaged, right? Because right now in American society, the dominant culture is people of European descent. And so for people of color, there might be this inferiority complex that develops that like, oh, I need to ascribe to things that look or speech or behaviors or mannerisms or culture aspects that exhibit people of European descent and whiteness and kind of downplay mine, right? And for white people on the other side, there's this idea of like, oh, well, I'm the dominant culture. I don't have to really consider other racial groups, right? And so as you work through developing a healthy racial and cultural identity, it starts with first, right, having an understanding of your own like racial identity and cultural identity within your family, your neighborhood, your schools, your church. And then as you do that, right, understanding other people's and their lived experiences and the ways in which one person might have privileges and you might have privileges and the other person has disadvantages. And how can I work to help people who have disadvantages, regardless of just like racial and cultural identity, but class differences as well is something that can show up. And it can be heavily tied to racial identity as well in America. So it's a really good model. I highly recommend, like, if you want to like look further into Helm's identity and see other people's racial identity versus your own and where are you in that model, right? Are you more in like a conformity phase where you're valuing whiteness and what that means over other identities, regardless if you're a person of color or a white person? And I think that everyone should take a look and assess where they may be. And if you're listening to this podcast about racial and cultural identity, that's amazing. And I encourage you to continue to do that work. And so, because I would want everyone, regardless of your background, to feel comfortable and safe and value their racial identity, right? The same way I didn't choose to be Black presenting, someone didn't choose to be white presenting. So I would want everyone to value themselves, but also recognize there are things that are fair that are not fair about why certain aspects of how we come into this world has created places of marginalization for others and privilege for other groups.
Absolutely. I think that's really, really important. The idea of valuing your own racial identity, your own culture, but also understanding that whatever that identity is in the context of other identity, right? The idea of your identity may be privileged over others. Your identity may be sort of, as you said, marginalized and pushed to the side or considered somehow negative, right? Especially to the larger dominant society, of European descended people. And you talked about conformity, the conformity stage, which is in the people of color identity model is the stage where individuals may unknowingly accept racial hierarchies, like the idea that whiteness is at the top and the other races are lower than that. And I'm wondering if you've seen in your practice or have an idea of like, what are some, like, if you've seen some subtle signs that parents might also notice that let them know that their kid might be in that stage, in that conformity stage where they think that whiteness is at the top, right? Whether they are a white child or whether they are a child of color, a Black child, an Indigenous child. Maybe there's some signs that your child believes that whiteness is best and everything else is not, you know? And if you notice that, what might you do about that? Or, you know, like what could be some things that you could do to help shift that ideology for your child, right? In baby steps, right? Because I imagine that it's a process, but if you are to notice that, and I wonder if you've noticed that amongst the people that you've worked with, this idea that maybe the person of color that you're working with has internalized some racism, right? And they see white people as higher than them or themselves as lower than white people somehow. I'm wondering if you've had any experience with that in your practice.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. There's several experiences that are coming to mind. I think I'll bring up one when I used to work as a preschool teacher's assistant when I was in college, right? And so it was like, again, I'm in a predominantly white community, and like, I am Black and Black presenting. And so I remember working with the kids, and they would ask questions about my skin color, right? And so like these are preschool kids, 3, 4 years old. And some of the times the teachers would be like, "Shh, don't ask." Like it was like a rude question, but it was sending this message that, hey, there's something wrong with that skin color, or there's a white skin color, and then there's that brown appearing person over there. And so those subtle messages of, oh, how come your skin looks like that? And it's completely understandable for a 3, 4 year old child to ask those questions, especially when they're growing up in a culture that predominantly presents one way that's pretty homogenous. And so that is a subtle way, right? Like, how come that person is darker? I remember another instance of like children making fun of another children's skin color for being darker than theirs, right? And I actually prefer the term like more melanin rich, because even the words light and dark has like these negative connotations. Like light is better and dark is like the villain and worse, right? And so maybe we should even work on how we describe the language around skin color, because there's some emotional charge around that as well. Like, oh, this person has more melanin than you, right? That's an objective statement.
That is a statement that I love. And that is a statement that I absolutely used with my own child, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh, it looks like that person has more melanin in their skin than that person over there, right?
Yeah.
You know, like it isn't necessarily just light and dark, right? Like, why is it light and dark? Because of melanin. Like, that is why people's skin is lighter and darker.
Yeah, right. And
some people have more and some people have less. That's it.
I would love for us to get to a place with like healthy racial identity and cultural identity. We look at it like, oh, some people have more melanin, right? That protects against the sun. Some people have less, right? As we've moved across, we all started off like closer to the equator. As humans are nomadic people, as we move further away from the equator, some people needed less melanin because they needed to absorb more sunlight. And some people are grew up really close to the equator and needed more melanin to protect from the sunlight, right? I remember having those conversations too, as I kind of gone through different like practicum experiences. As a psychologist, you have to do various different trainings, lots and lots of trainings. So like that was one of the things that conversations I had with children, right? Like just talking about melanin and why people have more melanin and less melanin, right? And understanding that right, as an objective thing. And I remember even in that preschool situation, I actually remember talking to the preschool teacher and saying like, hey, I don't mind doing a little fun assignment on color, right? And skin color, and how people have different hair textures and skin tones and celebrate it, right? And so I remember, the teacher got like different paints. And so I led it, and we we painted with the kids, and it was so cute. And it was more of a place where it becomes a celebration of diversity and differences, as opposed to, we don't talk about that, right? There's the norm, and then there's the other, right? No, like, we're a diverse community, and let's talk about it. Let's celebrate it, and let's talk about it early on, right? Asking your kids what they notice, right? If they bring up those questions, it's okay to be like, have some humility and say, like, you know what, I may not know everything, and I'm trying to understand too, and we can learn and read and understand these questions together. So if your child's asking, why does that person's hair look like that? Not saying like, don't ask that question, right? Like, lean into it, right? And actually, that from a pure helping a child, right, develop, it's great to encourage their critical thinking skills. Why does that person have that hair texture versus our hair texture? I'm not sure, sweetie, but like, let's go home and read some books and understand that together, right? Why does that person have darker, like, more melanin rich skin versus that person? I'm not sure, sweetie. Let's learn about that together. I think I think those are really important conversations to have. I think it's important to have those conversations even before your child starts bringing them up, because they are existing in a world where they're seeing differences in racial groups and economic privileges. And so having those conversations earlier on is super imperative to a healthy racial and culture identity, right? And I wouldn't want it to be that people look at the same way I would want a person of color to have a healthy racial culture identity. I also would want, like, a white child to have a healthy racial identity too. I wouldn't want them to feel shame and guilt about certain privileges, while a person of color feels like shame and guilt about having certain disadvantages. I'd want it to be like, okay, these are aspects of us that we did not choose. They exist. Let's talk about it. Let's celebrate it, and let's celebrate others too. Right? That is ultimately what I would want our culture in general to look like globally.
Yeah, I really love that. I think it's really important for everyone to feel good about themselves, at least neutral, right? Neutral to positive about themselves. And, and this idea of what you're talking about, sort of normalizing the diversity of skin colors, normalizing talking about the diversity of skin colors. Like, it's not impolite to notice, to like say out loud what your eyes can see, right? It's like, your eyes can see that there are people who have different skin colors here. I'm interested in why that would be, because I'm 3 years old and I don't understand why that person's skin color is that way and that person's skin color is another way, right? We don't have to make it either or, ours versus theirs, as you're saying. We can make it everyone is different. Why might that be? Why might people have different hair textures? Why might people have different eye colors? We were just talking about this the other day. We were talking about, it came up with my child who is 9 years old. The idea of, like, you talked about all those different trainings you had in psychology. And I was remembering when my child asked a question about eye color, I was thinking about, I remember learning about, like, alleles, in psychology, like learning about the genetics of, like, you get this from this parent, you get this from this parent. And, if you have one blue-eyed parent, if you have one brown-eyed parent, and the brown eyes are dominant, and the blue eyes are recessive genes, and, like, talking about, like, red hair and blue eyes and how that happens, right? Like, it's like the science of it, right? And talking about that with my kid was really interesting, because it was just talking about chromosomes and, like, DNA and, like, just the interesting ways in which, I think about it like that, that big jar at a fair of, like, jelly beans. And it's like, guess how many jelly beans are in there, right? It's sort of like everybody just has, like, a mashup of these jelly beans for their chromosomes. And that sort of, like, and whichever ones get selected, it's like that tells you what your skin is going to be like, your eye color is going to be like, your hair texture is going to be like. It's really interesting. It's really interesting to learn about how that happens. And all of those things there's no value on that. It's not like, if these chromosomes got selected and you got this eye color, that makes that somehow better or worse than another thing. It's just very neutral. It's just, that's what happened. Right. And I think speaking about it in that way, talking about melanin, right? That's one conversation. Talking about melanin and eye color and heredity of genetic characteristics is one conversation. And then it's like another conversation about the meaning people made about those things, right? The people made very neutral happenings have meaning in the world, right? And that is a separate conversation, right? Like somehow whiteness somehow ended up being, the thing that was quote unquote better, right? But that's not actually true. It's actually just a neutral random thing, right? Not random in terms of what you were talking about, the idea of we moved all over the world further away and closer to the equator. Like that too is a neutral thing that over time people made meaning of for, capitalistic reasons, but that's a different conversation. But I mean, when we're talking about just the racial identity development piece, the idea of keeping things in that neutral zone, right? Of just the facts of things, right? And making it so it's okay to talk about those facts, right? Normalizing talking about these normal, neutral facts that your eyes are actually picking up. And we know that even babies, 6 months old, can perceive skin color differences. So they know it's there. Not talking about it doesn't mean that the child is unaware that it exists, right? And when we shush children and say you can't talk about it, we are putting in their minds that there's something bad or wrong about talking about these things, and there's something mysterious or something that is bad or something here that people are sort of, the adults here are saying that like something is bad here, don't talk about it. And we don't have to put things that way.
Agreed. And it perpetuates this idea of that there is something, yeah, like you said, bad, and there's like a hierarchy here, right? If we have those conversations earlier on and maybe neutralize it and make it more of a dialogue, it could help combat some of the ways in which you've been socialized to perceive hair color, skin color, eye color, in emotionally charged ways as either a positive or a negative thing, right? There was a really influential study by Kenneth and Mimi Clark, right, that looked at different, they had children of different backgrounds look at dolls, right? Some were lighter and some had more melanin and some had less melanin. And the children had to choose which doll was smarter, which doll was prettier, which doll was better. And that study actually helped with the case, I guess, Brown versus Board of Education, to get rid of segregation in schools, because it was showing that segregation is actually detrimental to children, right? That's its own conversation. I could go really into that. But what made me bring that up is that like we can't just ignore race or culture. We have to acknowledge it, because if we don't acknowledge it, we are going to just assume that it's better, because the Black children and the white children both had a preference for the dolls with less melanin as opposed to the dolls with more melanin, right? They thought the dolls with less melanin was better, smarter, prettier, right? So they're getting messages so young. So it's such an important conversation to have with them so young to combat it, right? And you might think, oh, well, this study was so long ago. It doesn't happen today. And I remember learning in school, if you replicate that study, you would still get the same results. And I still see it like in the 2020s, like kids talking poorly about other kids' skin tones. And you might think like, oh my gosh, we're living in a society where we've overcome that. But no, like these things are still very prevalent today. And so talking about them in the family and trying to engage in critical thinking isn't going to dismantle it, right? But it'll be like maybe a gas mask against the poison that makes it seem as though certain skin tones and hair textures are better than others, right? Because it's still very prevalent in our culture today. And so it's going to take, the home and communities and neighborhoods trying to work to dismantle it, because it's been centuries of these belief systems that have been ingrained in us, right? The same way our certain foods we've eaten have been ingrained in us through generations. These beliefs about certain skin tones, too. And as I remember one time being so fascinated about understanding colorism, and it is global, right? And the Indian culture, the Asian culture, the European culture. the African, like it is global, right? And so it's a very important conversation to have to try to neutralize it. And when conversations or discussions are occurring where someone is being viewed as less than, to combat it, right? I would give a tip that I think everyone should talk about a person as if that person is in a room, right? So say I'm in a community, a homogenous community of only white people or Italian people or Indian people, Chinese people, you should be talking about another like culture or ethnic group as if they are in the room with you, right? And supporting that group and making sure that jokes or conversations that would kind of continue to support those stereotypes are not happening privately, right? And that would be a form of allyship that I would love to see more.
I love this. I love what you just said, right? I love this idea of pretend that person is standing in the room. What would you say? I know that we're talking about racial identity here, and you're bringing this up in the context of allyship with all other cultures and racial identities, which I think is amazing. But I am also thinking about it in terms of, again, I'm raising a 9-year-old right now. And, just relationally, right? Like this idea that, this is when bullying starts and those kinds of things. And like if we spoke about other people as if they could hear us, what words would we choose, right? Whether or not we have something challenging to say or we have something positive to say, how would we talk about it if that person were standing in front of us? And now listen, I went to PWIs, those are predominantly white institutions, and there were people who spoke right to my face, right to my face in ways that I was flabbergasted by. So it doesn't necessarily mean that just because you're pretending that other people are in the room that you're going to say something isn't that means that you will
hurtful.
Not say hurtful things, because sometimes you still do. But at the same time, you might choose your words more thoughtfully. And I think that's what's really important. You may intentionally try to not be hurtful, because sometimes I think that people have said things to me, not with intention to hurt me, but no one ever had a conversation with them about race before. So they're asking a question that is wildly ignorant and wildly insensitive, but they had no idea because they were raised in spaces where people shushed them if they brought up race. Right? So they don't have a way of talking about it. They're just saying the first thing that pops off their mind, and they don't realize how it's going to land on another person because we're not talking about these things. We're not having a conversation about how this could land on another person. But I think that's an amazing tip, and I'm banking that for myself. And I think speaking in melanin rich and less rich terms, and speaking as if another culture or identity is standing in the room with you, are two major tips for parents in engaging in conversations with their children about racial identity. So as we're wrapping up, a lot of people, as we're talking about, a lot of people who are raising children, working with children, have some fears about bringing up these conversations because they don't have a frame of reference for how to talk to kids about race. They want to have more conversations. They want to sort of pull back the curtain on racism, and they want to encourage their children to be anti-racist. They want to encourage their children to be inclusive, accepting, curious in a way of like, I want to learn more about lots of different things. And I want to know more about people who are, not just about people who look like me and have the same culture as me, but I want to know and learn more about all the other people and all the other cultures outside of myself. And parents are afraid to bring this up because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing, whether that's something that, as you were talking about before, something that will make my white child feel bad about themselves, or my child of color feel bad about themselves or other people. And so they have some fears about creating shame and guilt in their children about themselves or any other race. And so they don't bring it up. So they just remain silent. And so do you have any ideas about how parents might engage in these kinds of conversations, even when they're kind of scared about saying the wrong thing?
I think like being genuine, right? Like, hey, like this is a conversation that is like we didn't talk about when I was growing up. And so I want to like have these conversations, but like I might stumble, but I want to engage in these conversations because I think it's better to have those conversations with your family, right? So then in your family group, so then when you are outside interacting with different culture groups, right? That stumbling doesn't happen because you've never had those conversations because you were shushed as a child around them. So I think first starting early, having the conversations about different racial and cultural identities earlier on. I think celebrating different racial and cultural identities, right? Once a child has that instilled within themselves, like, oh, I should value myself, right? Like celebrating others too. Making sure that media, you're not using media that would probably perpetuate certain stereotypes of groups, right? So I would, if you're wanting to learn more about Filipino culture, right? Have the protagonist be a Filipino, and maybe the author should be Filipino too, right? So it's you're learning about that culture through the perspective of that person, right? If you're living in a homogenous society, which is really common, right? We do have, even in New York, there's pockets, right? Even it's diverse, but it's still segregated in a way, right? How making sure you branch out and have your as a parent, your friendships. If you notice, hey, my friends all look like me, you should be asking yourself that question. Why do all my friends look like me? Right? Right. Social learning theory. Kids learn through what is modeled in front of them. So you should be making friendships with different groups, exposing yourself to different cultures, having conversations with different cultures, really neutralizing it. If your child is feeling shame and guilt about their culture or racial identity, regardless of what it is, right? Ask them about it. Like, what are you feeling right now as we're having this conversation, honey? I'm feeling really bad about being white. I'm sorry. I don't want you to feel that way. Like, what about this conversation is making you feel that way? Well, like I'm noticing that I drive in this car, and my best friend drives in this car, right? And then that could be a great point to a great starter conversation to talk about different privileges and how, yes, there are certain people who have more than others, but how can you have grow in our agency to help others, right? You notice somebody on the street asking for money, right? Mom, why is that happening? Yeah, right. They're making sure not to blame that person, right? Talking about different systems. Yeah, there are certain ways in which life happened where certain people may be put in a place where they don't have as much as another person, but like, how can we work to help that person, honey? Well, maybe we could bake them cookies, okay, or some way where you can, in addition to learning about your racial and cultural identity, celebrating yourself, learning about other culture identities, like giving your child the ability to recognize that they have some agency and making, small changes in certain ways to make the world a little bit better, right? Because we all just want to, hopefully, as parents, I mean, if you're listening to this podcast, I definitely think you want to raise a child that is like, that's healthy and happy and has a good social emotional development, right? And makes the world a little bit better than they left it. And so having those conversations and increasing their agency can kind of help with that, and making sure that no child feels shame and guilt about their identity in which they come from is, I think, also valuable and really important.
I'm liking what you're saying, this idea of, finding out, being curious about your child's shame and guilt, seeing if you can draw out what they're feeling guilty about or shame about, and sort of, and using these kinds of conversation as jumping off points for other larger conversations about various systems that might be oppressive and might lead to, they all seem to lead to, there are people who have a lot and people who have much, much less. There's an opening for larger conversations. And also this piece about agency. What can we do about these things? What are something you would like to do about them? What changes would you like to see in the world? What changes do you feel like there should be in the world? And how can we as a family take some small step toward those kinds of changes? And then also the idea of, really letting your children know that you said this earlier, like letting your children know that you may not have had these conversations before, but that doesn't mean that we can't have them now and we both can't learn together about them. I think that's really very, very important. And so, we could talk about this forever, but I want to sort of wrap up. This is a really wonderful conversation. I would love to talk to you more about this and perhaps another passion of yours, any other passionate things that you have to talk about in terms of your practice or the work that you do. As we were talking before we started this interview, you talked about how much you love the work that you do and that it's even hard to take a break because you love it so much. So I'm sure that we can find lots of other things that we could talk about. But, ultimately, I wanted to have this conversation to start really just talking about ways that we can help our children grapple with the big questions, right? Like the big issues, the big questions. And so thanks for being here today to help us, take a small step in trying to do that. And I'd love to have you back to talk about other things as well.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you for having me. This was a really wonderful conversation.
Thanks so much. And before we end, let the listeners know how they can find you, if they want to work with you, if they want to follow your work, where can they find you?
I think the best way to reach me is probably through Psychology Today for now. My name is Dr. Khadijah Cyril, and you can look me up, and I would love to get in contact with you. And even if I am not able to work with you specifically, I would love to just consult and help you the best way I can. So thank you for having me.
Okay, well, we will put your Psychology Today profile in the show notes. So thanks again for being here and sharing your time and expertise with us. Project Parenthood is a quick and dirty tips podcast, and I want to thank our fantastic team. Dan Firabend audio engineers the show. Brandon Getches is our director of podcasts. Holly Hutchings is our digital operations specialist. Morgan Christensen is our advertising operations specialist. And Nathaniel Hoops is our marketing contractor.